Good afternoon, good morning. Hello, everybody. The microphone. Okay? Okay. Госпожо генерален директор на ЮНЕСКО, do you have translation devices? If someone does not have translation devices, they're at the back side of this hall, which today is full of people. I haven't seen this hall so full of people. Obviously, you're very interested in what UNESCO will tell us about preserving cultural heritage. Now, you have the translation devices. Госпожо генерален директор на ЮНЕСКО, господин президент на Полша, господин гъвърнър на Ричардсън, уважаеми Ваши превъзходителства, гости, министри, депутати, защо сме се събрали днес? Нека да пуснем една малка презентация на днешната конференция, с която ще се опитаме да дадем отговора на въпроса каква е основната цел на нашата конференция. Това е паметника на Буда, разрушен през 2001 година от талибаните. Отляво е паметника, отдясно е неговото разрушение. Това е голямата джамия в Алепо, Сирия, разрушена през 2014. Отляво е джамията, отдясно е нейното разрушение. Това е храма на Баал Шамин в Палмира, Сирия, разрушен 2015 година. Това е храма, това е неговото взривяване. Много шиитски и християнски църкви и храмове са разрушени ето по този начин. Ето по този начин. Кулите близнаци, които всички ние помним и промениха историята на света, бяха разрушени по този начин. Кой е следващия културен паметник, който ще бъде разрушен по подобен начин? Можем само да спекулираме. Дали това ще е Айфеловата кула? Тя би изглеждала така. Или пък това ще е базиликата Сан Пьетро в Рим. Тя би изглеждала така. Или пък това ще е статуята на свободата в Ню Йорк. Тя би изглеждала може би така. Или пък египетските пирамиди. Те ще изглеждат така. Тадж Махал в Индия ще изглежда така. Джамията Самара в Ирак. Иракският посланник ми подари копия от нея. Ще изглежда така. Забранения град в Пекин ще изглежда така. Какво можем да направим, за да се спре това разрушение? Ние трябва да вземем решенията днес, а не утре, когато ще бъде твърде късно. Ние искаме да задържим всички тези световни културни ценности, повечето от които са под надзора на ЮНЕСКО и лично на генералния директор, който при сърце е взел цялата тази тематика. Но отговора на този въпрос много се надяваме, че ще бъде даден на днешната конференция, която ЮНЕСКО с помощта на Атлантическия клуб в България и Института за културна дипломация в Берлин организират. Пред нас в панела имаме 3 души, които ще открият нашата конференция. Президента Александър Квашневски на Полша, когато споменах още в самото начало. Президентът Квашневски е историческа фигура в историята на Полша, в цялата история на Полша. Това е президента, под чието ръководство Полша се присъединява към НАТО. Това е президента, под чието ръководство Полша се присъединява към Европейския съюз. Това е президента, който може да бъде наречен баща на полската конституция и единствения президент в демократичната история на Полша, който е бил преизбиран. Аз лично имах възможността и удоволствието да работя лично с него в годините на министерския мандат. От него ляво е Бил Ричардсън. Има хора, които могат да се представят с много думи, но има едни такива щастливи политици, които могат да бъдат представени с малко думи. Губернаторът Бил Ричардсън е бил губернатор, конгресмен, министър на икономиката, министър на енергетиката, посланник на Съединените щати в ООН и в момента ръководи една фундация за опазване на екологията в Ню Мексико и един голям глобален център за решаване на конфликти. И нашият основен домакин в средата на масата, генералният директор на ЮНЕСКО, госпожа Ирина Бокова, която изкара 2 забележителни мандата като директор на ЮНЕСКО, първата жена на подобна позиция изобщо, която успя с силата на своята воля да вкара ролята на културата в устойчивото развитие. 9 от 17-те цели на устойчивото развитие, които бяха гласувани от Общото събрание на ООН през миналия септември, 9 от 17-те цели са цели на ЮНЕСКО, които лично генералният директор е лобирал една по една да влезат вътре. И тя беше единственият шеф на организация на ООН, който беше поканен да говори на глобалния съмит, организиран от президента Обама. И радвам се, че тук Американското посолство ще зарадва президента, че нещата, които са случили там, получават ехо и в България. Госпожа Бокова беше в правителството на България в едни от най-трудните за евроатлантизма моменти и мога да ви уверя, че много лесно се работи в лесни моменти. Аз съм работил по-скоро в такива, но тя е работила в много трудни моменти и затова приноса, който е даден за страната в трудни моменти, смятам, че трябва да бъде дадена относително по-голяма тежест. И разбира се, тук не мога да се изкуша и да не спомена, че лично аз се познавам с госпожа Бокова от 1990 година, когато бяхме заедно депутати в Великото народно събрание, първото свободно избрано Велико народно събрание в България след Втората световна война. И още там тя се превърна в един от първите поддръжници на атлантическата идея и стана член, учредител на Атлантическия клуб в България. Така че ние сме сега малко с връзки в ЮНЕСКО. С тези няколко думи искам да дам думата на генералния директор на ЮНЕСКО, госпожа Ирина Бокова. Моля да я приветстваме.
Благодаря много, господин Паси, скъпи Мони, за тази много приятна, много дружеска презентация. If you allow me, I will make my presentation in English. First and foremost, I would like to thank the President of the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria, my dear friend Solomon Pasi. I'm proud also to be one of the founders of this Atlantic Club, and it gives me a double pleasure to be here with you in my double capacity as Director General of UNESCO, and also I think you still consider me a member of the Atlantic Club. You have not excluded me from the club. And also to be...
Pay higher membership fee.
UNESCO doesn't have a lot of money, but that's another story. We can negotiate. But I'm really extremely honored to be here among President Alexander Kwasniewski, the former president of Poland, a very, I would say, emblematic figure for all of these East Europe, of our transition towards and joining us, European Union and NATO, and of course, Bill Richardson, the former ambassador of the United States to the United Nations. I mentioned maybe one of your, Mr. Richardson, important from my point of view positions also within the United Nations system, but I know that you have a long and very distinguished career as also a diplomat and as politicians, and Moni Pasi mentioned this extensively. So, ladies and gentlemen, ambassadors, excellencies, members of parliament, first and foremost, I believe that every generation faces challenges it must overcome. Today, I believe one of these is countering violent extremism. Rising to this challenge requires mobilization across the board. It calls for new forms of action, and it will demand time and will. I come from Paris. UNESCO is based in Paris, and we have seen on the 13th November the brutal nature of this threat. 130 men and women killed, 352 wounded, a state of emergency, a world shocked. These barbarous acts are part of a wider trend featuring the unprecedented rise of violent extremism. 215 opened with terrorist attacks in Paris on 7th, 9th January. It continued with the attacks against the Bordeaux Museum in Tunisia on 18th March. It included attacks in Beirut on 12th November, and unfortunately, the list is long. The big picture includes the conflicts in Syria and Iraq, instability in the region, and beyond. These, of course, are devastating humanitarian tragedies. As Mr. Lakhdar Brahimi, who is with us during this conference, maybe he's here in the hall, dear Mr. Brahimi, welcome here. I'm quoting you, who was the former joint special representative of the United Nations and the League of Arab States, and of course, among his other very distinguished also shows of his career, who were also saying that the devastating humanitarian tragedies are also conflicts where culture is on the front line. And we had seen also in these pictures on the 30th of August, the Temple of Bel was destroyed. The Umayyad Mosque in Aleppo has become a battlefield. On 4th of October, the Arch of Triumph in Palmyra was blown up. In Iraq, 2 of 4 World Heritage sites, Hatra and Ashur, and at least 9 other sites have been destroyed. In Syria, all 6 World Heritage sites have been damaged by fighting, 4 severely affected, including the old cities of Aleppo and Damascus. And across the region, illegal excavations have industrial scale, financing further violent extremism. We know, and one should say, that culture has always been the victim of war. But what we see today is quite new. We see the deployment of a strategy of deliberate destruction, of cultural cleansing, featuring systematic attacks against cultural heritage and diversity. Cultural cleansing is a war crime that involves massive violations of human rights and the persecution of people on ethnic and religious grounds. Muslims, Yazidis, Shabaks, Assyrians, Christians, all are attacked. It seeks to destroy identities, it tears the fabric of societies, it weakens sources of belonging. It attacks diversity to impose an exclusive vision of society. All voices of peace are targets. Just think of the barbaric killing of the scholar and humanist, the great friend of UNESCO, Dr. Khaled Al-Assad in Palmyra. And I was very privileged to visit Palmyra before the conflict in 2011 and to know personally Dr. Khaled Al-Assad, who accompanied me to admire the beauty of this extraordinary World Heritage Site. And he wanted to stay there. He wanted to protect it because he couldn't imagine his life without Palmyra. And we know that the history of this region is one of millennial dialogue across cultural and religious lines. It is precisely this history violent extremists are attacking because this history delegitimizes them. In 2012, we saw the same violence in Mali. Violent extremism is fueled by a global propaganda campaign on the internet, targeting young people to radicalize and create a sense of impunity for appalling acts. Between 50 and 70,000 Twitter accounts support Daesh today. The group has issued more than 700 videos only since 2014. And all these are high quality, multilingual, and carefully targeted, referencing popular films, video games, and music. And unfortunately, this is increasingly effective. Today, some 25,000 foreign terrorist fighters from over 100 states are active in Syria and Iraq, as well as Afghanistan, Libya, and Yemen. Violent extremism is the red thread tying this picture together. There is no single cause for its rise, nor is there a single trajectory leading someone to extremist violence. But what we do know is that hard power is not enough to counter a threat fueled by an exclusive vision of the world, based on false interpretations of fate, on hatred, ignorance, and intolerance. We need soft power as well. We need the message of the UNESCO Constitution written 70 years ago. I believe we face a global battle for hearts and minds of young people today. And this must start, as I said, with young hearts and minds. Let me highlight here last week's historic United Nations Security Council resolution on youth, peace, and security, underlying the role of young women and men in countering violent extremism. Violent extremists promote fear and division. We must respond with skills for critical thinking, opportunities for civic engagement, competencies for intercultural dialogue. Violent extremists preach exclusion and hatred. We must teach human rights, tolerance, and solidarity, because I do believe no one is born a violent extremist. Violent extremists are made, they are fueled. Young people today in these circumstances are learning to hate. We must teach them peace. I see this as the new front line today, in conflict situations, in refugee camps, in societies across the world. Education is the way to disarm processes that can lead to violent extremism, by undermining prejudice, by fighting indifference and ignorance. And this is what inspires UNESCO's action today. On 6 November, we held the first ever high-level conference on education to prevent and counter violent extremism with Mr. Anthony Blinken, United States Deputy Secretary of State, and more than 80 education ministers from across the world. Member states at UNESCO recently agreed on a resolution on UNESCO's role in promoting education as a tool to prevent violent extremism. At the invitation of the President of the United States, I spoke at the Leaders' Summit on countering ISIL and violent extremism in September in New York. And you can see, UNESCO is acting across the board to advance global citizenship education, to teach the history of the Holocaust and other genocides, to fight discrimination today and prevent new violence. The same goals underpins UNESCO's forthcoming Teacher's Guide on Violent Extremism. In Iraq, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan, UNESCO is investing in education for young internally displaced persons and refugees. The world simply cannot afford to lose a generation in this region to violence and extremism. The same spirit guides the UNESCO NetMet Youth Project to support young women and men in 10 countries across the Mediterranean. The internet, ladies and gentlemen, is another front in this struggle. We must respond to the propaganda of violent extremism, because violent extremists say humanity is not a single community, and we must respond. They say diversity is dangerous, tolerance unacceptable. We must respond by showing dialogue between cultures as the driving force of all history. This is why I went to the University of Baghdad last March to launch a social media campaign, Unite for Heritage, to counter hate propaganda, to strengthen the narrative of shared values and shared heritage. Last June, UNESCO held a groundbreaking conference on youth and the internet, fighting radicalization and extremism. And I thank particularly the government of Bulgaria for its support. The same goals underpin UNESCO's new initiative, empowering youth to build peace online, to counter youth radicalization. And of course, we must act also to defend humanity's cultural heritage, because I deeply believe this is not just about stones, bricks, and buildings. This is about human beings. It is about human dignity and identity. This is about culture as a force of resilience. And we have strong legal foundations to build on. This includes the 1970 Convention against the illicit trafficking of cultural property. This last February, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2199 broke new ground, banning cultural trade from Iraq and Syria under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Tasked by the Security Council, UNESCO is supporting governments to strengthen legislation, build capacities, deepen information sharing. UNESCO is working in very close cooperation in a coalition of partners like Interpol, United Nations Office of Drug and Crime, the World Customs Organization, and many, many others. We are bolstering coordination among law enforcement agencies, experts, museums, and auction houses, reinforcing legal frameworks and building capacity. And I believe our efforts are bearing fruit. Governments are adjusting and strengthening legislation, capacity building and training have started, and I'm determined to continue. This includes fighting impunity for war crimes. This is why UNESCO works so closely with the International Criminal Court. I welcome the transfer of the first suspect to the International Criminal Court in the Mali investigation for the war crime of the intentional destruction of monuments and buildings dedicating to religion. Of course, I mean what happened in Timbuktu and Gao in Kidal, where extremists destroyed mausoleums, burned manuscripts. And we must continue. Because, ladies and gentlemen, speaking about Mali, in 2013, I visited Timbuktu at the invitation to accompany him of President Francois Hollande, and I promised in front one of the destroyed mausoleums, I promised the local community to rebuild the mausoleums destroyed by extremists. Last July, I returned to Timbuktu with Her Excellency Ramandei Ramatoulaye, who is coming with us, the Minister of Culture. She will join us later this afternoon, Minister of Culture of Mali, to celebrate the reconstruction of all the 14 mausoleums. And I think it was a very moving moment because it was so important for the people of Mali. But it goes beyond the history of Mali. It is important for the history and the future of the Islamic world. It is important for all the humanity because the burnt manuscripts contain the wisdom of millennium of Arab philosophy, medicine, teachings, and also the transfer of the old Greek knowledge philosophers to the Western world. And I believe we did all this with the government, with the local communities, because we were determined to restore the glorious past, but also to counter violent extremism. This is how I believe we must take together at every level to overcome this challenge through education, through culture, through freedom of expression, through action on the basis of our conviction that humanity is a single community, sharing values, a past, present, and a future. And once again, I would like to thank the Atlantic Club, our partner in this important conference, because I do believe, being of course a Bulgarian, that people in Bulgaria are very sensitive to this history. People of Bulgaria have a deep sense of tolerance, of respect for multiculturalism and for diversity. And I'm sure that they're not only following, but they're suffering with the people of Syria, of Iraq, of Mali, and else, where they see the surge of this violent extremism. Thank you.
Thank you, Director General. Thank you very much for your so touching expose, and of course for the kind words which you mentioned about our joint organization. Sometimes we see that the Bulgarians, the Bulgarians have problems to govern our own country, but obviously the Bulgarians do not have problems to govern UNESCO and entities of this sort. So I very much hope that the election of Mrs. Bokova as Director General of UNESCO will pave the way for many more elections of this sort of Bulgarians on key international positions. And I know that everybody here has in mind one very big question in that regard. I'm right. Having said that, I will invite His Excellency, President Alexander Kwasniewski of Poland, to say what he has in mind to tell us. Mr. President, you have the floor.
Mr. Chairman, dear friends and excellencies, first of all, I'm very grateful for this invitation to be here with you in Sofia, at the conference organized by UNESCO, the organization which is very close to, I'm sure, all our hearts, and Atlantic Club of Bulgaria. I think this conference shows again that Bulgaria is a country which long tradition, long history of tolerance, a country which geographically is located on the crossroads of religious, of cultures, of political influences. And I think this is really a great place to discuss the situation which we have now with radicalism, with extremism, and how we can respond to these real challenges of 21st century. Please allow me, especially after such very competent and eloquent speech of Madame Bokova, that I will share with you with some political remarks, because I'm a politician. Salom Passi, in his kind introduction, informed you that I was 10 years President of Poland. When I think about my milestones, the milestones of my presidency, I'm very honored to underline the Polish Constitution, Polish NATO membership and European Union membership, and to some extent also Ukrainian democracy and Ukrainian road to European structures, because from the very beginning I'm very much involved in all these processes of Ukrainian sovereignty and democracy. Solomon also correctly informed you that I'm only President of Poland who was 2 times elected. It means only one who was re-elected. And when I see the situation in my country now, I think that this record can be continued in next years. But seriously speaking, I want to tell you that the problems are quite dramatic. Of course, Irina is right when she said that each generation, each time has own challenges, and to say that the world is changing, that is very banal observation. Of course, the change from the very beginning, the world from the very beginning is changing, and that is natural element. We can say even that the most stable element of the humanity is change, because we have change and again. But what is necessary to say that the changes of the last 20 years, because of the technological revolution, of the new type of communications, are extremely deep, and they really changed very much political life, social life, and the situation in the world. We have, in sense of this technological changes, even each year new phenomenon, we have new devices, we have new possibilities, and of course even we politicians or we intellectuals or others, we cannot follow all these changes as fast as these changes are going, what creates a lot of misunderstandings, conflicts, etc. The second important element of this time is that the architecture of the world, the architecture of the global world changed also very much. Time, and especially I'm speaking here in Bulgaria, you know very well what was the time of Iron Curtain, of two blocks, etc. This time it's finished. Was finished almost 20 or even more as 25 years ago. The next years we had such a little bit naive feeling or thinking, what Fukuyama said in his famous book, End of the History, that now is time for democracy, for human rights, for liberal systems, for market economy, etc. And of course it worked. It worked at least 1 decade, maybe even 2 decades, and changed very much the picture of the world, because never in the history of mankind we have so many, let's say, democratic, free market-oriented states on the list. But after these 2 decades, we have to say that this naive thinking that now only is the end of the history and now we have only the system which will protect and which will respect democracy, market economy, human rights, rights of the minority, etc., is not serious now. We have extremely difficult time and dangerous time with a lot of fears, with a lot of tensions, with a lot of conflicts. And it's necessary to say that today in the contemporary world, in this global politics, we have no one place which is able to control all these changes, all these tensions and the problems. America, United States lost this leading position which this country had in the last 20 years. China still is not prepared to play such a role. They want to do it and they will do it because this is a question of time only, but very typical for Chinese behavior is patience. They are very patient. They wait for this time when they will be the superpower #1 in the world. We have a lot of ambitions from Russia because they want to stay as one of the players on this global stage. We have increasing position of Latin America. We have Africa, which own ambitions, and we have, of course, the European Union with a lot of own problems, which we can observe even each day with some countries inside European Union, Greece, today British referendum, now refugees crisis, etc., etc. But of course, that is a topic maybe for next speech, but speaking about today's topic, is necessary to say that we are in the most dramatic, in the most difficult period of the history in the last many decades. And it's necessary to understand that everything what we have in front of us can be more complicated and not less complicated, can be more dramatic and not less dramatic. I'm sorry that at the end of the year, when normally we wish all the best for the next year, I'm not enough optimistic. I'm quite pessimistic. But if we are politicians, we are the leaders of civil society, it's necessary to understand that all the challenges which we have now and which will come next year will be extremely complex and will be necessary to react with all our potential, our opportunities and power. Pope Francis said some weeks ago that in fact we have a World War III in pieces. It is difficult to compare with very well-known First World War or Second World War, but in many regions, in the many places, we have the same situation as we experienced during these two, the most dramatic wars in the history. Maybe this opinion is going too far, but I'm close to say that really we have something what is the real problem. That is the world war, it means the very global problem, which we have in the pieces, what probably is some advantage for us, because to have such conflicts in one piece would be probably too complicated and impossible to control. Because if you see this vacuum of leading forces in the world, if you see that new architecture of the politics is creating now, but we have still many years to see such real picture of new centers of politics and economy. It means that for some next year we should accept the situation that the leading force of the politics, leading force of the global relationships will be much more chaos and not leading position of one country. If we see the weakness of many international organizations, including United Nations, because this organization was built at the end of the World War II and was very successful in this first period of its activity. Today is a question how to reform this structure, and we cannot resign of the United Nations because we have nothing instead. We have nothing instead, and that is something what we have to do now. And of course we have this violent extremism, which we observed in the United States, in Paris last weeks, in many places of the world. And of course, if you want to fight against this violent extremism, we have to eliminate the reasons of this extremism on the soil, exactly in the places where this extremism exists and is developing. What is a very difficult task, because it means that we cannot use one method, that is not only the politics, even that is also not military measures, what they have a lot of own limits. We can eliminate the leaders, we can eliminate some units or some troops of this extremism, but if we will not change the situation, economical situation, political situation, if we will not change the mentality of the people, we have no chance to finish this never-ending fight against violence and extremism in these places. So if we want to make the list of available methods which we can use to fight against this extremism and violence, I think two are really very important, and then we are in on the topic of our today's conference. It's the culture and education. But I want to add one more, that is reconciliation. It's reconciliation which, in my opinion, because about culture, Irina Bokova said a lot, and I fully agree with her opinion. Education, especially education of women, I think, can be decisive element of the change of behaviors in these regions of the world, because I'm sure that I'm not wrong, that the female, they propose to us much more moderate, much more tolerant approach to many complicated problems. And I think this education of women and the rights for women in these regions, they can change political situation and these tensions very much. But Irina Bokova is, especially is difficult to add something after her speech. So I would like to concentrate your attention on this question of reconciliation, because it was one of important elements of my presidency and of my achievements. If you want to limit the tensions, if you want to limit these problems, especially among the countries which historically were fighting each other, it's necessary to propose the real politics of reconciliation. In Poland, we tried quite successfully to do this reconciliation process with Germans. You know the history, our main enemy during 1,000 years. Today, together with Germany, we are in the two most important political and military blocs like NATO and European Union. But we started this reconciliation process with Ukrainians, with Lithuanians, our neighbors in the last centuries, and the history is full of dramas, of crime, of extremely painful chapters. I propose also such very long-term project of Polish-Jewish reconciliation, because you know very well that Poland was, before World War II, the place of life of the biggest Jewish community in the world. Before World War II, Jewish community in Poland was something, they were Polish citizens, of course, but the Jewish community was something around 3.5 million people, in the United States 3 million. And of course, because of Nazis, because of Holocaust, more as 3 million Polish Jews were killed in death camp, in concentration camps, etc., etc. But this history was extremely complicated. It was 1,000 years of common history of Poles and Jews and Polish soil, good and bad, with fantastic pages and with very dramatic pages, with fantastic person and oppression, etc. But this process was necessary to open, even it was quite painful for both sides, I guess. And today I can say that the renaissance of Jewish culture, the renaissance of Jewish history and such understanding of the role of Jews in Poland increased very much in the last years, especially among young people. Of course, for this process of reconciliation helped us very much the construction of the Museum of Polish Jewish History in Warsaw. If you will have a chance to visit Warsaw, I invite you very much to see this unique museum, which is a place of education, is a place of reconciliation also. When I speak about reconciliation, it's necessary to understand the reconciliation, unfortunately, should start with the politics, should start with the political decision of the leaders. And when I see the ambassadors of Balkan states, when I see the people I visited some more weeks ago, Bosnia and Herzegovina, I understand that this reconciliation process, that is a real base, that is a pillar for next steps. And this reconciliation, this is first, political decision, we have to do it. The second is education. Third, school books. We cannot promote hatred, we cannot promote all these bad things in the books. It doesn't mean that we will not speak about the truth, we will not speak about the real history. But it's necessary to show these different points of view, the different approaches. The culture and the artists, they have a huge role to play in this process of reconciliation, because probably the books, especially the school books, are not so popular as a good movies, as a good romance or literature, which can show that we are human beings. And for us to be with this or another one nationality is important. But first of all, we should be tolerant. We should create relations with peace, with understanding, with mutual understanding, etc. So I think in this process, our combat against violent extremism, this reconciliation should play also important role, and this is something what I would like to add to this very important and strategic ideas of Irina Bokova. And finally, I want to say, and that is a little bit echo of the words of Mr. Passy, I think we should fight together. If we want to say one day that the problem of terrorism is a problem of France, or this is a problem of the United States, it means that we open doors for terrorism everywhere. If you want to be successful, if you want to be effective in this fight against extremism, it's necessary to fight together. It's necessary to cooperate. And that is, I remember very well these words after September 11th in New York, when everywhere in the world we heard such sentence: today we are New Yorkers, today we are Americans. Last weeks we were Parisians, we were the French people, etc. But this sentence should be the part of our understanding of our life every day. It cannot be only during commemorations or during the funerals, because it's not enough. We should understand that our success depends on our cooperation and our unity. If we will be united, we have a chance to fight. For this, united efforts, we need organizations. One of these most important organizations is United Nations. And I think, and that is something what I want to say from my heart, that if one day United Nations, the most influential and the most important organization of 200, I think 200, how many members? 119 countries. I think only track and field organization is bigger, or FIFA is maybe bigger as the United Nations. But I don't ask Irina Bokova to be president of FIFA. I would like to wish her to be next Secretary General of United Nations. And I think with her knowledge, with her experience from UNESCO, and with this fantastic achievements, which you have in this organization, I think would be great to see the person, the politician, the diplomat, and the female who understands very well that to solve the problems, the politics is not enough. It's very important to use education, to use culture, to use reconciliation, and to use this very special, very unique approach, which we know from Irina's side so long time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, President Kwasniewski. Listening to you, I once again came back to the old conclusion that the European Union and the world in general need and lack leaders like you. I'll be very much happy to see you once again on a big, big international position. And I want to salute in this cultural setting Minister Atanasov of Science and Education, who is together with us. And I want also to encourage all of you to follow the example of the Turkish ambassador, the Turkish ambassador I mentioned, to follow the example of the Turkish ambassador and tweet from here. He is doing this. Never mind that he is absolutely exhausted from the visit of his prime minister to Bulgaria. He is doing his obligations to the Atlantic Club, tweeting in competition with the honorary consul of Seychelles Islands, Maxim Behar. So I will count who will have more tweets after that. I will retweet both of you. If we want, however, to unite the world, it is very difficult, I would say impossible, to make it without the United States of America. We need the United States of America to unite the world, and that's why I'm extremely pleased to invite to this podium a person who has the capability, the ability to unite the United States, Governor Bill Richardson.
Thank you very much, Solomon. And I want to thank also Irina Bokova from UNESCO, Solomon Pasi from the Atlantic Club for inviting me to beautiful Sofia and to speak to you today. This is my third visit to Sofia, and what a better example of culture and heritage and historic buildings and tradition and history than this wonderful city. President Kwasniewski strikes me as he's ready to run again. He's so eloquent and fit. And I do agree with Solomon that the world needs statesmen like him. Lakhdar Brahimi, my dear friend, he's been a special envoy to about 50 troubled spots around the world, and it's good to see him again. I want to just talk a little bit about more the national security side of this terrorism issue. I'm not an expert on diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, education, but I'm going to try to frame the arguments in the context of why this is important to all of us, this issue. It's important to Bulgaria, it's important to Latin America, to Africa, to Asia, to the European Union, to Eastern Europe, to America. Let me just focus first on the United States and Bulgaria. We've had a long history of partnership in security matters. Bulgaria has proven to be one of the United States' most outstanding NATO allies. President Obama himself has praised the government's commitment to fighting terrorism, supporting American efforts in Afghanistan, to rebuild a country, help its people have a brighter future. In fact, Solomon Pasi has to be credited with bringing Bulgaria into NATO, into the European Union. I'm so pleased that he's still a very active member of the foreign policy community. I had an honor and chance to meet him and his wife, Mrs. Pasi, who was also a minister here. And I'm delighted again to be with so many of you. So what we've seen in the last year has been the rising extremism that has caused, for instance, in my country, in the United States, the main issue in the presidential race is now national security, terrorism. It's supplanted the economy, which traditionally has been the main issue in any presidential race. But it's not just America. The violence has been raising its ugly head across the world, in the skies above the Sinai, on the streets of Paris, at an open-air market in Beirut, and finally in my country, at a facility for disabled people in San Bernardino, California. So the impacts of violent extremism are not confined to one part of the world. We've seen the deadly consequences of this extremism and radicalization in our own communities. The people that groups like ISIS are recruiting can come from any country. They can be male, they can be female, they can be any ethnicity, with or without religion. They're disaffected, they're angry, looking to hurt those that they see as different. They're looking to inspire others in our communities to commit horrible acts of violence. Extremism has sown tragedy in too many communities. Countering it is essential to the security of all countries and all communities, and no one can meet this challenge alone. Securing the future against terrorist threats means our governments, despite our differences, have to work together and break down the barriers of ignorance between our peoples. And yes, the key here is education. We have to tackle this challenge from every angle, disrupting plots, destroying safe havens, cutting terrorist funding, and deepening our focus on prevention and education. We have to defeat ISIS in the battlefield in the Middle East, but that is not going to be enough. We have to prevent it from radicalizing, recruiting, and inspiring others to violence in the first place. This means defeating their ideologies. Ideologies are not defeated with guns. They're defeated by better ideas, more attractive and compelling vision of a future. Now, we recognize that our best partners in protecting vulnerable people from surrendering to violent extremist ideologies are the communities themselves, families, friends, neighbors, community, and religious leaders. This past year, we've seen horrific and tragic assaults on our shared heritage and values. Ancient treasures in Iraq and Syria have now become the casualties of continuing warfare and looting. And it's taken people like Irina Bokova and Solomon to deal with these issues effectively to try to keep these heritage sites open and accessible to all. No one group has done more to put our shared cultural heritage in the gun sites than ISIS, than Daesh, or ISIL, however you want to call it. They are not only beheading individuals, they are tearing at the fabric of whole civilizations. They have no respect for life. They have no respect for religion. They have no respect for culture, which for millions is actually the foundation of life and the shared bonds of our communities. Far from hiding their destruction of churches and mosques, they broadcast these with pride for all the world to see their acts of depravity and for all of us to be intimidated. That's why they do it. For the proud people of Iraq and Syria, the destruction of their heritage is a purposeful final insult. Another example of ISIS's implacable evil. These acts of vandalism are a tragedy for all civilized people, and the civilized world must take a stand. These violent extremists are also targeting our youth, young people in our own local communities. They exploit social media. They use flashy graphics, images that could be taken from modern video games and tourist brochures. They prey like wolves on isolated and vulnerable individuals at the heart of our communities, radicalizing them with tales of false injustices and hollow promises. They make people turn away from their loved ones and fill their hearts with hate. Too often we turn a blind eye to the most vulnerable until tragedy strikes, but by then it's too late. So there are 3 steps, 3 things, 3 issues that I think governments can do to push back against this rising threat and protect our communities from radicalization and extremism. So what are these 3 things? First, closer cooperation among countries, among peoples. That has to happen. We need to work more closely between governments to understand the precise nature of threats and to better coordinate international responses. This means shared intelligence, more dialogue, putting aside our differences on trade, on commerce, on many other issues. We need to share more information about foreign terrorist fighters and those returning from conflict in places like Syria and Iraq. Those returning already radicalized can, like a virus, infect others in our communities, spreading their hatred and fear of others. Second, working with local communities. And what I think is most fitting here is that effective interventions often begin and grow within local communities. Government partnerships are critical, but the best solutions are bottom up, not top down. We need to work more closely with civil society, with local community groups, religious groups, human rights groups, to tap into the talents of communities which might otherwise be left on the sidelines. Empowering our local leaders is one of the best ways to stop extremism from flourishing. That includes especially women and girls, who are some of the most effective voices in countering this violent extremism. Who is better than a mother to spot unusual behavior in her child and intervene? We need to support projects that train women to recognize the signs of recruitment and radicalization in their families and communities, and to devise prevention strategies. I know that UNESCO's been doing fantastic work under Irina's leadership in education and women's empowerment, and we're very lucky to have her leading this effort. The role of police is also very important in our communities. Often they're held as examples of being outsiders to a community with a negative input, but we need to change that image. Police are important, and they're good people. They're part of our communities, our families. We need to help them build trust and strengthen cooperation between themselves and the communities vulnerable to radicalization. They face a daily challenge in protecting our society and the pressure to avoid making mistakes that will result in the loss of life, which is immense. We need to help them in our communities, and you know this has been a problem in my country. Many of our police need to reflect more of their communities. There has to be more diversity in their makeup. There has to be more community policing, so we have not been perfect here. Third point, greater opportunities. We need to create opportunities for our marginalized populations. If from an early age, young people can picture a promising future for themselves and see a path to reaching that future, they're going to be less likely to turn to violence and extremism. We need to increase access to education and offer training, leadership skills, and mentorships. Perhaps the United States, working with many here in Bulgaria, and increase our efforts to bring English to many communities, bring the French bringing their own languages, the Germans, the diversity of our cultures. We need to make a real impact in the lives of these people. We need to give young people hope and a brighter future to aim for. What violent extremists are trying to do is destroy the physical culture in the Middle East and also the core values we share and enjoy at home. Through twisted versions of education and evil propaganda campaigns, it is trying to sow divisions among our different communities and faiths, creating separation where none should exist. Extremists want to rob future generations of any connection to this past. We can see this with the sheer cultural barbarism of looting a museum, smashing thousands of years of culture to dust. We can see it when they try to radicalize our youth with a profoundly evil and medieval ideology and worldview. That is the future they're trying to create. That is what is at stake. And if you leave it unstopped, if you don't stand up, we're all complicit in the crimes that happen. So, in conclusion, one, our heritage and our values, everybody here in this room, are the same. They're under threat at the moment, and the world needs to act now as one, not as several, not petty rivalries, but as one. There are short-term actions that will hurt the physical presence of ISIS in the Middle East, but we also have to look at the long-term solutions that will stop the rot in our communities before it sets in. Education, cultural awareness are key to success. Extremists exploit fear that is a result of ignorance. Reducing ignorance helps to remove fear and in turn removes the power of hate that extremists need and exploit. So I'd like to conclude my remarks by commending the remarkable work done by Irina Bokova at UNESCO on this issue. Remarkable work worldwide. You have a gem in this woman. Under this leadership, UNESCO is at the forefront of the fight against terrorism, cultural cleansing, and terror financing. This would have been unimaginable 10 years ago. She has totally reshaped and reformed the institution. And you know she's done that without the help of the United States. For some reason, our politics are such that we couldn't do what we should have. But the fact that the White House and the State Department are pushing hard to restart U.S. financing of UNESCO after it was stopped for many years clearly shows how respected she is in Washington, D.C. by the current administration. And we need more leaders like Solomon, like the president up here, like Irina, to ensure that we're on the right track to overcome extremism. And by the way, since the president said something that I want to repeat too, I'm out of government. I'm a private citizen now, so I can do and say whatever I want. And I want to just say to you, I was ambassador to the UN. I was a congressman. I was Secretary of Energy. I also ran for president, but you all forgot about that. I didn't do well. I was running against Obama and Clinton in the Democratic primaries. I used to be fourth in all the early primaries. You probably saw the Republican debate last night, 18 candidates. You know, there were only 8 of us. I used to be fourth, but it was not my year. But I ended up endorsing President Obama, and I watch politics. I do commentary, and I'm still involved. But I care deeply about the United Nations. My best job I ever had was at the UN, which, by the way, I noticed that the president and Solomon and Irina were talking. There are 196 countries that signed the climate change agreement. So I think it's 196, maybe 93, 92, depending on the latest statistics. And I believe that the time has come at the United Nations, since we talk about all the people that are suffering or disaffected. Number one, that there has to be the first Secretary General that is a woman. That is a woman. Number two, Eastern Europe has not had a Secretary General. And you know, it rotates by region. There's nothing in law that says it has to be a Latin American or it has to be well, it can never be an American, we know that. But there's a European, Asian, Ban Ki-moon is from South Korea now, but there's never been an Eastern European. And I believe that needs to happen. And then you have to look at the record. She's had 10 years at UNESCO and done a remarkable job. And she, I believe, is going to be a candidate because a lot of countries want her to be a candidate. I don't speak for the United States. I want to state that clearly. But I do have a knowledge of the respect that she has in America. So since the president did it, and he's a former president, I tried to be a president, but I didn't make it. I want to say too, that I think that the time has come for a woman, for a leader with experience that has had UN support, UN contributions, somebody from Eastern Europe, from Bulgaria, somebody that has the support of so many cultural and educational institutions. And so I joined the chorus of those supporting Irina to be Secretary General. I hope when she comes back next year to address this same conference, she comes as Secretary General of the UN, and I hope that that happens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Governor. I remember the first meeting between the King of Bulgaria, Simeon II, who was Prime Minister at that time, and President George Bush. President Bush approached the King and told him, I know that they told me that you're Prime Minister, but I don't buy this stuff. You're Your Majesty. So listening to Governor Richardson, I was a little bit hesitant whether to take it for granted that he's a private citizen, having in mind that he has the ear of President Obama. Having said that, and I would very much echo what he said about the usage of games and technologies by the terrorists. I read somewhere that one of the most attractive gadgets that the terrorists are using to communicate between themselves, this is PlayStation 4. This is PlayStation 4. So they're much ahead of us. We have to run, to tweet, to retweet, to enter into PlayStation 4 in order to catch up. This was the opening by three great transatlantic, I would say, and global leaders of our panel. President Kwasniewski, Director General Bokova, and Governor Richardson. And I would like, however, to underline that they opened the door to not less interesting discussion of great selection of speakers, which will come in a minute here. These are Mark Donfried, who will be moderating the first panel, Maxim Behar will be moderating the second panel according to the changes in the program. We have Lagdar Brahimi, Special Advisor to the Director General of UNESCO. He is next to me. Gürçan Türkoğlu, the President of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee. Professor Markus Hilgert. We have also the Minister of Culture of Mali. She couldn't come for the opening because of late flights, but this is one of the most interesting spots on the earth and most important spots. So I would very especially want to underline this speech. We have also Professor Itamar Rabinovich, who was a legendary ambassador of Israel to the United Nations. And we have again Bill Richardson, and we have Jengir Han from the UN Counterterrorism Implementation Task Force. And for closing remarks, we have the Deputy Prime Minister of Republic of Bulgaria, Meglena Kuneva. I very much hope that she and the rest of the governmental officials will succeed to make it, because what we have today, something which was not expected or projected, is changes in the Bulgarian constitution, which requires huge discipline, and I received a phone call from the chairwoman of the Cultural Committee in the Bulgarian Parliament. She was supposed to speak after that, but she told me this is one of the cases in which we, the parliamentarians, cannot make what we want. So please stay on your seats, and let's applaud our three great openers of this event. And if there is anybody who wants to, well, I forgot something. There is a present. There is a present for the Director General of UNESCO. This is a famous Bulgarian architect who wants to unite the culture with the belief and the future. And this is something which, well, please show it here. Покажете.
Това е една картина от моята изложба "Светлината, метафора на духа" в Министерството на външните работи тази година, която беше посветена именно на прекрасната инициатива на ЮНЕСКО, Международна година на светлината 2015 година, и която чрез своите образи подобрява именно духовния аспект, духовния аспект на културата. Червената църква в Певещица, всички знаят кои са световни паметници на културата в България, Рилски манастир до север, така че се радвам просто за вашата вдъхновена дейност, именно за пазване.
Това е подарък от един артист, това е подарък от един художник, това е подарък, както каза Бил Ричардсън, from the down to the top. Благодаря ви. Okay. Who wants to make a picture with our panelists is most welcome. Come for family photo.
I'm so embarrassed. President Krasnevsky is a good friend of mine, and he started talking to me. Mr. Manila? I'm so sorry. Very pleased, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you very much.
Come. Okay, thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we are about ready to begin the opening panel discussion for the afternoon. So if I could ask you to please take your seats once again. I'm delighted to also introduce the speakers. So I think we're about ready. So once again, if everyone could please take their seats towards the front of the room would be excellent as well, in case others join us as the session goes on. So ladies and gentlemen, it's really an honor and a pleasure for me to have the opportunity to serve as chairperson for this panel discussion on a topic which I think is only increasing in importance as we look at the global political situation currently. The panelists I will maybe mention first by name, then I will say a few words of introduction to try to set the framework for some of the reflections that I would love our panelists to consider, and then we will open up also for questions and participation from all of you. So ladies and gentlemen, the topic of this discussion, building a global coalition for the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. I'm very happy to be joined by Lakhdar Brahimi, Special Advisor of the Director General of UNESCO, Gurchan Turkoglu, President of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, Professor Dr. Marcus Hilgert, Director of the Ancient Near East Museum, Berlin State Museums, and the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. So ladies and gentlemen, as the director and the founder of the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, I always am trying to reflect what is the need for cultural diplomacy? What is the goal of cultural diplomacy? And I think as we look at this topic, it's important for us to, as was done by the previous speakers, reflect on some of the challenges that we're currently facing in the global situation. So I'd like to begin by quoting actually an expert on terrorism, the famous Walter Laqueur, who made a statement after September 11th that I think is still very much relevant today. Walter Laqueur said the following: "Far from being on the verge of a new order, the world has entered a period of great disorder. In facing these new dangers, a re-examination of old priorities is needed. Cultural diplomacy, in the widest sense, has increased in importance, whereas traditional diplomacy and military power are of limited use in coping with most of these dangers." As we think of the challenges that we're up against currently, such as terrorism, I would argue that one of the biggest challenges we have is not actually fighting violence, although of course many of the terrorists are very violent. But actually, Joseph Nye, when he gave a lecture at the ICD a number of years ago, said actually when you look at someone such as Osama bin Laden, Professor Nye would consider bin Laden actually an expert of soft power. He didn't pay anyone to fly into the World Trade Center. He didn't scare them into flying into the World Trade Center. He attracted them to his interpretation of quote-unquote religion. And that was actually in bin Laden's soft power. So in that framework, I would argue that culture, whether it's cultural diplomacy or cultural protection, is of utmost importance. Now, very often our enemies tend to notice this more than we do, in the sense the first targets very often are cultural artifacts. The first targets are actually those cultural monuments, which are actually so important to our history, although we tend to forget that, especially when it comes to funding decisions, whether it's organizations like UNESCO or elsewhere. Cultural diplomacy, at the Institute for Cultural Diplomacy, we would see the goal is to educate, to enhance, and to sustain relations with the goal of building trust. And therefore, the final reflection I would make also for the consideration of our panelists is we need to also balance protection and innovation. Of course, the goal of cultural diplomacy is not like a glass jar that you put over culture. Culture lives, it breathes, it evolves. And I think really this balance of the innovation and how one can foster innovation, equally important to also the issue of protection. So I very much look forward to the discussion with our panelists on the issue. Once again, building a global coalition for the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. I'd like to begin the panel by asking Lakhdar Brahimi to offer some words of welcome and reflection from his point of view, where you see potential and how we might be able to build this global coalition. So please, if you could give also a warm welcome to Lakhdar Brahimi.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Chairman. It is really a great honor and pleasure to participate in this conference, and I congratulate warmly Madame Bukova, the Director General of UNESCO, and Mr. Fassi, on behalf of the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria for organizing this conference. I'm very much a layman in matters related to culture. But I have dealt with conflict in a number of times in various parts of the world. and I did see from close quarters what conflict does to art and culture. My last encounter with conflict, as some of you know already, was in Syria. And during my very, very first appearance before the Security Council in October 2012, I drew attention to what the conflict was doing to the hugely important and remarkably diverse cultural heritage of that country. I spoke in particular of the church in the city of Homs, built in the year 59 after the beginning of Christianity. And the mosque built also at the very beginning of Islam, next to this church, and both were severely damaged. In consultation with Madame Bukova, I warned the Security Council several times that the continuation of that senseless war would not only damage Syria's present and jeopardize its future, it would also damage its past, destroy its past. And that past of Syria is also our past. That culture of Syria is also our culture, as UNESCO has repeatedly stated. Things, unfortunately, have gone from bad to worse, not only in Syria, but also in Iraq. I'm sure that all of you remember how the very, very important museum in Baghdad was looted under the eyes of the invaders. There is now a glimmer of hope that UNESCO is not alone anymore, as governments and civil society are mobilizing better to face these catastrophic developments. And I think the speakers who opened this conference have all spoken about the necessity of building this international coalition, and also of the fact that this is taking place. Not fast enough, but it is taking place, and there is more awareness. I'll make three main remarks. One, the perpetrators of these attacks on culture, they do that only after they and others, or only others, have attacked people. So I think we cannot forget, no matter how important cultural heritage is, we cannot forget that in situations of conflicts, our first priority must be protecting the people before talking about monuments. The second remark is, as the saying goes, 1 ounce of prevention is better than a pound of cure. But in this area, quite often prevention is difficult or impossible. And in general, prevention is easy to talk about, not easy to implement. 3, because of that, because of the difficulty of doing prevention, UNESCO, its partners and its supporters generally arrive when the harm has been done. And what we really should be talking about mainly is how to pick up the pieces. How are we going to pick up the pieces? So, and that is what this coalition should do. As I said, prevention is very, very, very difficult to do. But there is one way of preventing this from happening, and that is by preventing conflict. If Iraq had not been invaded, a lot of the horrible things that have happened to people and to monuments wouldn't have happened. In Syria, if the government of Syria had responded positively to the demands of its people for dignity and liberty. That's all they were asking. They were not asking for regime change. If the government had responded, nothing of what we have seen happen would have taken place. That kind, the next best thing, since those preventive actions have not taken place, is to end this conflict. And I think we have had, I'm sure everybody in this panel and in this room are aware that there were lots of opportunities to end the conflict in Syria. And those opportunities have not been taken. Now there is a new glimmer in hope with this meeting that has taken in Vienna and the meeting that is going to take place on Friday in New York. This is about prevention. Let me say also that as none of those preventive activities I've just said were left, UNESCO has the lead and is trying to do its very, very best to pick up the pieces and to preserve what can be preserved. And I think we have got now to see how we can rebuild what can be rebuilt. In Kabul, when the Taliban started to destroy the priceless objects in the great museum there is in Kabul, what has been done by the staff, they have stolen a lot of the objects from the museum and taken the risk of really losing their life doing that. They have hidden those artifacts in their homes or elsewhere, and they have brought them back as soon as it was safe to do so. In Syria, a story that has not been in any newspaper as far as I know, 7 young people in a city in Raqqa when ISIS or ISIL or Daesh took that region. One of the things they did was to bring down a cross from above the church. 7 young people in the middle of the night went out, and to the risk of their lives, they put that cross back. And I think Irina has spoken about Khalid al-Assad. A lot of people like Khalid al-Assad, who are not as prominent as he was, are taking risks to protect their heritage, their and our heritage. So this is, I think we should enable these people who are, there are many, many of them in Syria, many, many of them in Iraq. I understand that now they are taking pictures. UNESCO has already a very good database of all the monuments that exist, but I think there are others that are not known even to UNESCO. So I think it would be good to equip and encourage young people and others in these countries to complete this database by taking pictures, by drawing, by doing whatever they can do to while waiting for us to be able to. Reconstruction, of course, will take place in due time. There is a big debate, as you know, on whether reconstructing is necessary, important, or shouldn't be done. In Bamiyan, in Afghanistan, when you see those niches empty with Buddhas, it makes you cry. So there is a debate. Do you reconstruct these Buddhas, or do you just keep these niches for people to see that there was at one time these Buddhas there? I would like to congratulate Irina Pukova on 2 things. One, for the extraordinary work she's doing, but also, I think both she and Bill Richardson are here, for the kind words they have said. And congratulate Irina Pukova for having recruited Bill Richardson as part of her campaign for the UNESCO, for the United Nations. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brahimi. We'd be very happy now to welcome the President of the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, Mr. Gurcan Turkoglu. If you could please give us your remarks.
Thank you. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I must begin by expressing my appreciation and gratitude to UNESCO and the Atlantic Club of Bulgaria for organizing today's conference on a very key issue of our times. I'm sure that this conference will contribute to developing of a new security agenda against violent extremism with a focus on education and culture. Indeed, educational institutions and cultural heritage are under a heavy attack of terror, violence, and extremism. This assault is not only material, but also ideological. Therefore, working on education and culture, paradoxically, also appear to be one of the remedies of the problem. I will focus on cultural heritage today because of the emergency and widespread effects of the unprecedented situation in a geography not far away from here. It is unprecedented because it is the most massive and extensive attack since the Second World War, and this attack is ongoing. Actually, in the recent decades, there had been some hints of risks for heritage under conflict in cases like the civil wars in the former Yugoslavia or Afghanistan and elsewhere. And there have been considerable damage to heritage, resulting both from deliberate attacks and from the effects of the conflicts. The current threat is massive and extensive in the sense of the geography it covers, the forms it has taken, the target it aims, and its consequences. With regard to geography, as you all know, it covers a wide area from Iraq to Libya, to Yemen, to Mali, and there have been also individual cases, attacks to museums in Tunisia and Egypt. It has taken many forms, from deliberate attacks to the heritage, to effects of the armed conflict, even sometimes use of sites for military purposes. Also, the neglect of the sites, results of the neglect, looting, and smuggling are other forms this threat has taken. Regarding the targets and consequences of those attacks against cultural heritage are also very extensive. Monuments, sites, and museums, among them World Heritage sites, Sufi shrines, religious sites have all been targeted. Libraries and archives have been affected. Intangible heritage, that is cultural traditions, are also under risk because of the displacement of people and migration and refugees. Attempts of cultural cleansing is harming cultural diversity immensely. As a whole, a great damage is being done to intercultural dialogue. In face of such a tremendous threat, international community has some opportunities and some challenges in front. If I begin with the challenges, first of all, the extremists and terrorists are impossible to engage in a dialogue. Working under armed conflicts and violence, as you would imagine, with warring parties is very complicated for the experts. Difficulties of coordination and cooperation among actors and institutions is faced with as usual. Resources necessary to face the threat are not abundant. Economic and financial crisis in the world makes this problem more serious. Heritage issue is sometimes considered of secondary importance due to the huge humanitarian suffering and casualties. Therefore, the mission of protection of heritage is multifold. First of all, compensation of what is destroyed is a mission. Secondly, prevention of further damage. Thirdly, a plan for post-conflict period is also necessary. So we have a huge mission in front of us. Among the gloom, there are also some opportunities and some good news, I should say. First of all, I must emphasize the leadership role displayed by UNESCO. I was ambassador of Turkey to UNESCO 5 years ago, when the problems began in Syria. And I personally witnessed very closely the leadership role the Director General, Mrs. Irina Bokayes, shows in confronting the risks to heritage from the first days of the clashes. I have also witnessed her very sensitive and alert attitude on this issue. UNESCO Secretariat was monitoring the developments on daily basis. The Director General was holding constant consultations with the experts, and because UNESCO considers this work at the heart of UNESCO's mandate, since cultural destruction is an affront to common human values, which are symbols of identity and elements of social cohesion. The Director General has set the mission of UNESCO as, first of all, creating international awareness. I can give the Unite for Heritage campaign, the articles published in the international press, speeches in major forums by the Director General or other UNESCO officials are examples of this effort to create international awareness. Secondly, sharing of information universally, the findings, the facts on the ground regarding the destruction of the heritage. These were done through websites or through the emergency actions in Iraq and Syria units, which were established after the clashes. The most important mission, which is the theme of today's conference also in a way, is to increase coordination and serve as a catalyst to bolster cooperation and mobilize governments and stakeholders. Actually, this was a major occupation for UNESCO and the preoccupation for UNESCO and the Director General. And I think UNESCO has been successful in this regard. I can mention among many activities the December 2014 conference in Paris, which gathered all the actors concerned on this issue, launching of global coalitions in Bonn and New York during the United Nations General Assembly. During the 39th meeting of the World Heritage Committee, the committee issued a very important declaration in general regarding the protection of heritage, but with a very important focus on the heritage under conflict. This is a very comprehensive declaration. You can find it in the websites. It's called Bonn Declaration because the committee met in Bonn. Among many other recommendations, and the committee called all the parties of the armed conflict to refrain from military use or targeting of cultural and natural heritage sites and monuments that constitute flagrant violations of international law and to comply with their obligation under international treaties. The committee also recommended the Security Council of the United Nations to analyze the possibilities of introducing a specific dimension of heritage protection in the mandates of peacekeeping missions. Another recommendation was the committee called the state parties and other interested parties strengthen their legislation regarding combating all forms and aspects of trafficking in cultural properties. The committee also requested UNESCO to enhance its international leadership on the operations. Also invited the countries to coordinate their bilateral and international emergency relief projects for achieving the maximum possible benefits. Another important document that I would like to mention is the strategy document adopted by the General Conference of UNESCO regarding reinforcement of UNESCO's action for the protection of culture and the promotion of cultural pluralism in the event of armed conflict. Actually, this is a long-term strategy. I am brought a copy just to show you that this is not just words, but very comprehensive, very carefully worked out document with very concrete proposals for the members of UNESCO, the governments, but also for civil society, even individuals, because this is a work, as today the theme of the conference is about a global coalition. So everybody can make a contribution, and through this document of approved by the UNESCO General Conference. There are many other, of course, activities in this direction. As we mentioned before, Unite for Heritage campaign and similar campaigns which have been announced on the website of UNESCO. This is the first important good news, I should say. I mean, UNESCO is playing very important leadership on this issue. UNESCO has acted very early, I must confess, earlier than the governments related or of the neighboring countries. Second good news is about 2 months ago, World Bank and United Nations, during a meeting they held in Lima, Peru, have launched a push to raise billions of dollars in the bond markets with the aim to leverage financial markets to raise funds to tackle refugee issue to roots. They plan to dramatically increase economic assistance to the countries hosting people fleeing Syria and Iraq through special bonds guaranteed by donor countries. The primary goal will be building infrastructure, hospitals, homes, and schools. But what I want to mention today is that I hope these funds related, the funds necessary to the protection of cultural heritage should be covered also under this plan. I can give as some concrete example how the refugees, can benefit. For example, scholarships can be given to Syrian and Iraqi youth, young students to specialize in heritage protection issue. Or some workshops can be organized in the refugee camps to protect the intangible heritage of Syrians, like dances, plays for children, and many others. Another good idea is the idea of a protected cultural zones developed by UNESCO and which is waiting to be heard and considered by the parties, especially warring parties. The last item in this regard is the danger listing mechanism of the World Heritage Convention, and this can be instrumental in the protection of World Heritage sites under conflict. One item, again, as a good news, I wanted to mention, but the Director General Nabokova already mentioned in her speech, is that International Criminal Court began legal proceedings last October against an individual linked to Al-Qaeda, accused of destruction of 10 religious sites in Timbuktu and Mali. Timbuktu in Mali. This is the first time that ICC will examine the destruction of cultural heritage as a war crime. I hope that this case will have a deterrent effect on the terrorists elsewhere working on crimes related to cultural heritage. Another issue that I think is very important is post-conflict preparations that can be considered now. International community should begin planning now how to compensate the socio-economic and cultural damage caused by the armed conflict and terrorism. Therefore, once carefully thought through, these plans should be made public and promoted in order to inject hope and optimism to the depressed people of the region. I believe that UN agencies, especially UNESCO, should be given strong support by the international community in their efforts in this direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Tukoglu, and I have a number of follow-up questions, but I'll save them for the discussions. To conclude the panel, the final presentation, before we start the discussion, is the Director of Ancient Near East Museum, Berlin State Museum's Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation. We very much look forward to your statement. Professor Dr. Markus Hilgert.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here in Sofia. It's my first time. Very impressed by the beauty of the city. And I would like to thank the organizers of the conference, Director General Irina Bokova and President Solomon Pasi, for inviting me to be here today with you. Cultural diversity. The events of the year 2015 have taught us a painful lesson. Cultural diversity, the epitome of humanity, dignity and freedom, is under attack. Too vivid, the images of plundered World Heritage sites, burned libraries, and murdered scholars. Too shocking, the fate of the millions who used to live and identify with this cultural heritage, but were forced to leave it behind and take unspeakable risks to save their lives. And too widespread, the fanatics' dehumanized and simplistic narrative, wrongly acknowledging only one truth, only one culture, and only one faith. However, there is also something else that we have learned in 2015. We have learned that we're by no means helpless, especially not when it comes to the protection and sustainable development of cultural heritage. We have come to understand that we possess the political will, the knowledge, and the capacities to protect the world's heritage even in situations of crisis. And last but not least, it is beginning to dawn on us what would be necessary to put these tools to effective use, what measures we would have to take in order to protect cultural heritage as a proud and visible token of the sheer infinite cultural diversity of humankind. First of all, there are significant political responsibilities involved, such as promoting sustainable heritage protection as a strategic development goal on a global level, or disseminating the idea that the crisis of the world's cultural heritage is an integral part of the global humanitarian crisis and has to be addressed as a violation of the fundamental rights of humanity. At the same time, there are also more tangible challenges to be met when the future of the world's cultural heritage is at stake. Both as a scholar specializing in ancient Near Eastern studies and as the director of the Ancient Near East Museum at the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, I know from firsthand experience that sustainable heritage preservation requires academic expert knowledge and institutional infrastructures through which this expert knowledge may be applied and transferred. It is for this reason that today I would like to highlight the role of public expert institutions such as the Ancient Near East Museum as institutional pillars of a global coalition for the protection of cultural heritage and diversity. Established at the end of the 19th century, the Ancient Near East Museum houses close to 600,000 archaeological objects, mainly from Iraq and Syria. Among the highlights of its permanent exhibit at the Pergamon Museum are reconstructions of the famous Ishtar Gate of Babylon and the processional way of Babylon, as well as the monumental stone sculptures excavated at the site of Tel Halaf in Syria. More than 95% of the museum's holdings stem from regular, well-documented archaeological excavations. They entered the collection on the basis of parted agreements with the respective countries of origin. Today, the Ancient Near East Museum is well on its way to become a public expert institution for cultural heritage research and preservation, serving both as a core facility for cultural heritage protection and a highly visible advocate for the archaeological heritage of Iraq and Syria. It is my firm conviction that leading archaeological museums all over the world need to acknowledge their moral obligation and social responsibility to mobilize their unique expertise for the global campaign to safeguard the cultural abundance of the past. Why is it a moral obligation to engage in this global effort? Because we would not be public expert institutions and we would not have the capacity to help if the countries of origin, now in turmoil or under attack, had not agreed to share with us their rich heritage, and because it is in our own vital interest to promote cultural diversity and academic freedom in these countries. Against this backdrop, the Ancient Near East Museum has been adapting its institutional profile since 2014 and is now actively engaged in research and practical measures that may contribute to the fight against illicit trafficking in cultural goods, build capacity in the area of cultural heritage protection in Iraq and Syria, standardize processes of preventive digital documentation, and raise awareness of the need to develop global strategies to preserve the cultural heritage of mankind for future generations. These activities would not be possible without the generous financial support of the German government and the close cooperation with powerful partners such as UNESCO, ICOM, and the German Commission for UNESCO. Illicit trafficking in cultural goods poses, and this is my firm belief, the biggest single threat to the cultural heritage of mankind. For institutions with high visibility like archaeological museums, fighting illicit traffic starts with taking a bold public stance, adhering to a strict code of ethics, and cooperating closely with the respective countries of origin. At the Ancient Near East Museum, pertinent measures include a general no acquisition rule, a very restrictive policy on the preparation of expert reports, as well as comprehensive provenance research. As the Interpol Expert Group on Stolen Cultural Property concluded during its last meeting in June 2015, data gathering and systematic research are of high relevance for combating the illicit traffic in cultural items. Together with an extended network of partner institutions, including UNESCO, ICOM, the Federal Criminal Police Office, and the German Foreign Office, the Ancient Near East Museum is spearheading a new national research project analyzing the illicit traffic in archaeological objects, mainly from Iraq and Syria. Funded by the Federal Ministry for Education and Research for a period of 3 years, this research alliance features an innovative methodological design combining academic and non-academic expertise. Most importantly, this transdisciplinary research project called ILLICID aims at developing and testing criminological methods for an in-depth analysis of illicit traffic in cultural goods, focusing on object types, turnovers, networks, and operation modes. We're hoping that the results of our research may also contribute to the successful long-term implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 2199 on a national level. At the heart of capacity building lies the exchange of knowledge and experience between experts. We're facilitating this interpersonal knowledge transfer by bringing to Berlin colleagues from our partner institutions in Iraq and Syria in order to discuss all questions related to the protection and study of archaeological heritage. In November, for instance, we hosted 2 conservators from the Syrian Directorate General of Antiquities and Museums who attended an intensive training seminar in the preventive conservation of cuneiform tablets at one of our conservation laboratories. Concentrated work sessions like these play a crucial role in establishing the international expert networks urgently needed for a sustainable heritage protection on a global level. At the same time, it goes without saying that the transfer, development, and implementation of knowledge need an adequate political, and infrastructural framework to be in place. Together with our colleagues from the Iraqi Ministry of Culture, we're therefore aiming at defining the parameters of such a sustainable capacity building framework in the context of the Iraqi-German expert dialogue on Iraq's cultural heritage at archaeological sites and museums, ICASM. A joint initiative by the permanent delegation of Iraq to UNESCO, the German Commission for UNESCO, and the Ancient Near East Museum, this expert dialogue is funded generously by the German Foreign Office. It was inaugurated with a first round of bilateral consultations at the end of July. These extremely productive talks centered on several preparatory topics, such as the current capacity building priorities as perceived by Iraq, not perceived by Germany, but as perceived by Iraq, the adequate principles of implementation, as well as the types of required infrastructures and technologies. Some of these required infrastructures and technologies still have to be developed further in order to meet the challenges of cultural heritage documentation and protection in situations of crisis. This applies in particular to innovative technologies such as the 3D digitization of archaeological objects. Bearing in mind this research deficit, the Ancient Near East Museum has been leading in the establishment of a new Center for Digital Cultural Heritage in Museums, CEDICUM. Financed by the Federal Commissioner for Culture and Media, CEDICUM serves both as a research institution and a core facility for all of the archaeological collections of the Berlin State Museums. Among the center's objectives are the generation, storage, and flexible use of 3D models of archaeological objects, as well as the optimization of mobile and economical solutions for preventive 3D documentation in situations of crisis. An essential tool, both in the fight against illicit trafficking of cultural goods, as well as in the area of awareness raising, are the red lists of cultural objects at risk produced by the International Council of Museums. For the 2015 update of ICOM's emergency red list for Iraq, the Ancient Near East Museum has provided a considerable number of provenance objects, object descriptions, and a German translation. The German version of this timely update has been sponsored by the Prussian Cultural Heritage Foundation and will be launched on January 14th, 2016 in Berlin. And I should mention here that the Red List program would not be possible without the generous financial support of the State Department of the United States government. Last but not least, we're proud partners of UNESCO's Global Unite for Heritage campaign. However, our partnership with UNESCO in this outstanding enterprise is not limited to spreading the word about the imminent threat to the world's cultural heritage. Rather, we're also developing joint projects and new formats for an intensified mutual transfer of research data and expertise. Coming to a close, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to stress 3 points. 1, we need to realize that sustainability, more than anything else, is a public discourse, a multi-voiced and colorful discursive process involving a wide variety of participants, both on national and international levels. A sustainable heritage discourse among global partners acting on equal footing can thus also become a means of social integration, cultural reconciliation, and post-colonial intergovernmental rapport. 2, a common point of departure for all actual measures towards a sustainable heritage protection has to be the consensus that the preservation and development of the cultural resources of humankind is a global challenge in need of both a global strategic response and the corresponding political will for implementation. And 3, public expert institutions like the Ancient Near East Museum possess a specific capacity to contribute significantly to a global coalition for sustainable heritage protection and cultural diversity, thereby establishing a new operative paradigm for archaeological museums. Whether these public expert institutions will be able to live up to this potential will depend entirely on their openness to these tasks and their willingness to adapt their institutional profile accordingly. However, in the face of the violent cultural extremism and the brutal narratives of hatred and death haunting us these days, museums are able to embark on this promising mission by disseminating the one discourse they're perfectly cut out for, that of social diversity, cultural equality, and infinite human creativity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Hilgert. We'd like to take questions from the audience, but before I give the microphone to you, I wanted to ask maybe one question of the panelists. We had a very good discussion so far outlining the role of global governance organizations, such as the UN, outlining the role also of the private sector in terms of financial markets, etc. And just now, of course, the very impressive role that museums can also play. One question that I had is where you see the potential and also the role of civil society, because I think really if this is going to be a sustainable coalition, however the coalition may look for cultural protection, I think the key is partnering also with civil society. Now, of course, civil society means different things also in different countries, but I'd be very happy to hear some reflections where you see the role and where you see the opportunity of civil society to also join in this greater coalition. This is for any or all of the panelists.
Very shortly, participation of civil society on protection of cultural heritage in general, and especially in the extraordinary circumstances we are living, is essential. Both UNESCO and World Heritage Committee sees the civil society as an indispensable partner in this effort, in these efforts.
In the countries concerned, there is a great pride in what they have, which is not only theirs but also world heritage. And I think you will find a lot of people not only willing to cooperate with UNESCO, with museums like yours in Berlin, but also to take risks. The thing is, how are you going to identify them? How are you going to contact them? How are you going to work with them? In a place like Iraq, it's now relatively easy. Not perfect, but it is relatively easy. In Syria, it's a little bit more difficult. But you know, there are organizations that exist inside and have also branches outside. I think one should identify them. And you know, one of the things that need to be done is, you know, what I think, and quite a few people are working on that. Few NGOs from outside, in the United States in particular, is to see how they can, you know, cooperate with the means they have, taking photos, writing, you know, about a small monument or an archaeological site that has been affected, and saying how it was and so on. I think there is a lot of work that they are willing to do, they can do, if UNESCO and others can you know, can be in touch with them and help them and encourage them to do this work.
I think that when you talk about a sustainable protection of cultural heritage, you cannot discount the civil society and the contribution civil society can make. I think Ambassador Richardson pointed this out earlier. As you know, UNESCO has developed a strategic program of the 5 C's, and one of the C's is community involvement. And I think this shows how important it is to have a local community that is willing to dedicate resources and time to the protection of cultural heritage, which means you don't only have to empower the local communities, but you also have to educate them. And this starts in kindergarten, this starts in primary school. This is why it's so important to bring the topic of the protection of cultural heritage, also the topic of illicit trafficking in cultural objects, into schools, because this is where it starts. And you also, of course, need an academic infrastructure so that the expert knowledge is present in the country that is concerned, and is not subject to the import of knowledge that comes from the global north. I think this is very important, that in times of a post-colonial relationship of states, you have expert knowledge in the country that can sustain and develop itself.
No, thank you for that. I think in many ways what is needed is some sort of an architecture in that sense. I think we all agree the potential is there. The question, of course, really then remains how one does that. And I think there, especially as one looks at civil society in different parts of the world, can also have very different manifestations. So no, thank you for those reflections. Let me now maybe give the possibility to you to pose questions or comments. I see already a few hands. It looks like we have a wireless microphone, and if you could also briefly introduce yourself, that would be interesting for the panelists. So we know also where you're from, please.
Thank you. My name is Margarita Kaisheva. I'm representing a coalition for safeguarding cultural and natural heritage 5 years ago. It is called Interpret Europe. It is based in Germany. It also unifies organizations from US, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and so on. This organization is dealing with interpretation of cultural and natural heritage. So I was carefully listening to all of you, and I think that this is the link when we speak about prevention or sustainability or the role of museums, because we need the message delivered to the minds, to the hearts, and to the souls of people who and transfer not only information but also knowledge to them about the preciousness of heritage. And we are dealing quite successfully. Last year, we had a conference in Krakow on interpreting sensitive heritage. It was maybe too early now or the next years. We may come back to the same concept, having in mind the developments in our neighborhood of Europe. What I mean to say is that it is not, it is a question, but also a request and a plea to all of you. We would be very much interested to cooperate and collaborate and to exchange our experience. And one small thing I would also like to mention about the loss, very significant loss in Syria. It was when the genetic resource collection of Syria was bombed. And this is was a huge loss for the community because all the genetic resource material disappeared. Hopefully, shortly before that, it was saved in Svalbard. I met one of those Syrians who were part of that, of those people who took the collection as to back it up in Svalbard, in Norway. And a few months ago, they asked Svalbard to give it back to them to use it for reproduction somewhere else in the world. They didn't say where. So, I would really like and be happy if we can establish some working contacts with you and work on that in that field. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we look forward to exploring those opportunities. Additional questions or comments for the very prestigious? Yes.
So good afternoon. My name is Borislav Kusturkov, a professional journalist and a member of the management board of the Union of Bulgarian Journalists. So my question could sound a little bit idealistic or romantic, but it's addressed to all honorable members of our first panel. And the question is, do you see any possibilities of contacting, probably directly, some of the more reasonable, sober, but influential persons of ideal, IDS and so on, just to be aware of the cultural heritage and to do their best to preserve at least these areas rich in cultural monuments? Because probably this could be the most efficient way of protection. Thank you very much. It's addressed to all members of the panel.
You know, if you are talking about the fighters, ISIS, Nusra, all the bad guys, yeah. I think things are different from one place to the other. I can tell you a story about Afghanistan. Mullah Muhammad Omar, the leader of the Taliban, when they took Bamiyan, and some of their young commanders started talking about destroying the Buddhas. I happened to meet him soon after that. And we had a long discussion. And we are talking here in 1999. You know, they took Bamiyan in 1998, and they destroyed Buddhas in 2000. In 1999, this is not a story I heard from somebody. This is a personal, one-to-one discussion with Mullah Muhammad Omar. After a long discussion, he told me the following. Because I told him, you know, these Buddhas are part of the culture of countries like Japan that are helping Afghanistan, very, very much. He told me this is not part of the culture of Japan, it's part of the culture of Afghanistan. And nobody will touch them. So, what made Mullah Omar change his mind from in 1 year, then to be adamant in saying that the Buddhas must be destroyed, and they were destroyed. So in some cases, I think if, other people must have talked to him after I did. But perhaps people like me did not continue to talk to him. So in this case, maybe an opportunity was lost. At present, in Syria and Iraq, I don't think that people from ISIS, anybody in ISIS will be willing to listen to anything that you or I or anybody else can tell them. But others can. And I am absolutely certain that within the armed groups in Syria, quite a few are probably, no, it's not probably, I'm sure, that quite a few are doing their very, very best to protect their heritage. But on the other hand, probably the leaders, especially of ISIS, are not interested in anything. There is nothing you can do to change their mind.
I would like to second that, because when you look at the situation in Syria, it's not just Daesh or ISIS, but it's also other militant Islamist groups that are plundering heritage sites and museums to earn money. And we know from cases where, again, the local community has used existing connections to talk to the leaders, the new leaders of these groups, and talk them out of plundering very successfully. This, again, underlines the importance of effective and empowered local communities, because it's usually people on both sides who've known each other for a very long time, both the militant groups and the people that are trying to protect museums and heritage. So I think, yes, it can be done. In some cases, especially in Syria right now, it is being done. But at the same time, you're walking a very, very thin line, morally and ethically, when you talk to potential future stakeholders. You always have to bear that in mind. You have to know whom you're talking to. And I think this is a decision that has to be made on a case-to-case basis on moral and ethical grounds.
As you said, it's an idealistic thing, but I heard of I have an anecdote about Mosul. I heard that when Daesh was attempting to destroy a religious site, maybe a Sufi shrine, the women of the town surrounded the site and tried to prevent Daesh destroying the shrine or site. And I heard that, of course, this is not a confirmed anecdote, but I heard that they have succeeded in deterring Daesh from doing this. So there are good examples. Next.
Thank you very much for the answers, but what I really meant was also UNESCO as an institution or other governmental or non-governmental agencies, not only the local communities, and using their personal private acquaintances with some leaders of these groups.
This is a very complicated thing because to have a dialogue with terrorists is one of the most difficult and impossible missions, I think. But of course, utmost should be done to reach the people. For example, this social media campaigns, I'm sure, is reaching to members or sympathizers of Daesh also in the occupied parts. And also there have been some, for example, about Palmyra, there were hesitations because they announced that the site was destroyed and then it was not confirmed. So we thought they were deterred from doing so, but also it's very difficult to get confirmed information from those towns occupied by Daesh.
No, and I would agree. I think obviously we need to use every tool at our disposal. So there, of course, if there are opportunities, whether it's for UNESCO or other organizations, those opportunities should be taken. However, the point I made in the beginning, unfortunately, very often these are intentional acts of destruction as opposed to unintentional. And in that case, I think, as they were saying, it's very hard to negotiate with terrorists who very often are intentionally destroying the culture. Sometimes it's priority one. So therefore, of course, it can be almost impossible. We have actually run out of time, unfortunately, for the panel. So I think this is an occasion maybe to conclude the formal part of the discussion. We have a coffee break, so hopefully during the coffee break we can continue in an informal way. But I wanted to thank the panelists for, I think, a very thought-provoking discussion. We didn't come up with the answers, so to speak, of how to design this coalition, but we certainly did underline the importance. And I think I speak on behalf of all of the panelists in saying that we are all eager and open to establish partnerships that would lead in the direction of this coalition. So we'd be very happy also to approach any of you later on if there are any other specific proposals for how we can actually create such a coalition. So I'd like to ask you, and please joining and expressing our sincere gratitude to all of the panelists for the discussion. And we now have a short coffee break. Thank you.